Well, hello, all you jolly seafarers. I thought I'd just try and experiment this time around in talking about the tribal class destroyers. I've sent on a link to some interesting stuff that is on YouTube anyway. But in addition to that, here's some additional thoughts. First of all, let's look back to the situation at the tail end of the First World War when, first of all, the United States had built very, very large numbers of destroyers, and indeed so had the Royal Navy. And so both were fairly well off in terms of destroyers, certainly through to about 1930. Japan, on the other hand, had been in a situation where it had taken part as one of the major allies, well, not much involved in the naval war, and it felt itself aggrieved by the naval treaties afterwards, which didn't give it parity with Britain and America. So their priority, where they were limited on capital ships, was to build quite powerful destroyers and cruisers, which they started to do in the late 1920s. So the Japanese destroyers of the late 20s were quite radical in their design. They tended to feature 6 medium caliber guns mounted in turrets, capable of anti-aircraft fire, which was well ahead of the time. The Americans, on the other hand, like the British, had largely delayed constructing new destroyers. When they'd done so, they tended to produce stuff around about 1,300 tons with 4 or 5 guns. And over a period of time, these became somewhat outclassed by foreign construction. The French had also gone in for large destroyers with 5.5-inch guns, and the Germans, when they started building in earnest, started producing, again, large destroyers with multiple 5-inch guns, which were significantly more powerful on paper, although given to poor reliability and poor seakeeping qualities as well. So we have a situation in the late 30s where the Royal Navy starts to look at the destroyer fleet that's got, and also to look at what's possible under a treaty limit of 1,850 tons. If we take 2 typical designs from that period, which actually adhered to the treaty as opposed to breaking it, the American Porter class were fitted with 8 5-inch guns in twin turrets. Although interestingly, they were only low-angle guns. At this stage, they hadn't really anticipated the need for high-angle guns for anti-aircraft work. The tribals were a little bit more compromised in that respect because they mounted 8 4.7-inch guns in twin turrets, to some extent at the expense of torpedo armament, which was then reduced to 4 tubes. The 4.7-inch guns, however, although it was a powerful gun armament, while in theory they were designed for anti-aircraft work, in practice were limited by their lack of elevation to 40 degrees. This is explored both in the Wikipedia entry and also in the Drachinifel video, essentially to say, well, these ships were designed for longer range barrage fire in protection of a fleet and not necessarily for self-protection, something which was very much to their cost. So I think that was an interesting design, really. I mean, certainly the tribals were regarded with great affection, and they were beautiful looking ships. They were in some respects the end of a line in that their construction was, although larger than their predecessors, was still of the same general layout with 3 boilers and not particularly radical in their construction. If you come onto the destroyers which followed, they went to longitudinal framing and 2 boilers, and that was followed pretty much universally in the destroyer construction that the Royal Navy had thereafter. The choice of guns for the tribals is interesting because the Royal Navy had messed around with lots of different calibers and lots of different designs over a relatively short period. For example, although the 4.7-45 that was introduced around about 1930 was a decent gun, and normally with separate loading to reduce the weight, its range was limited to about 17,000 yards, which is roughly comparable to the American 5-inch 38. But interestingly, when you talk in terms of high-angle mountings, the Royal Navy already had high-angle mountings for the 4.7-inch gun. They'd been using the 4.7 40 caliber on the Nelson, Rodney and some other ships from the late 1920s, and these guns had an elevation of 90 degrees for anti-aircraft use. The main limitation that I can see is that they fired a fixed round, which was quite heavy, about 76 pounds. And this was just thought to be too much for a gun crew to handle on firing rapidly for longer periods of time. So the Navy had skirted around this with the tribals by adopting separate loading of the cartridge and the shell. But interestingly, if you then look at what follows the tribals with the J class, sorry, not the J class, the L and M class, these had produced a completely different gun. It was a 50 caliber 4.7-inch gun with a more powerful shell, 62 pounds, and that was fired a fixed round, which was heavy. So it's as if different bits of the Admiralty hadn't really lined up what their priorities were. The 4.7-inch 50 was an excellent gun, but powerful and expensive, so therefore wasn't really going to be perpetuated. Yet at the same time, the Navy was developing the 4.5-inch gun, so why have a slightly different caliber in the first place? And then why experiment with the range of mountings that they had? So they produced a turret to go on the aircraft carriers and the capital ships, which could elevate to 85 degrees. They also had an open-backed turret on the Ark Royal and on some of the depot ships, which allowed for a twin 4.5-inch with 85 degrees of elevation. And also the Army had the Mark II version of the 4.5-inch gun used as an anti-aircraft weapon, and that elevated to something like 85 or 90 degrees as well, although that fired fixed ammunition. So it's a real mishmash of different calibers, different platforms to mount them on. Really quite unsatisfactory, I think, in terms of logistics planning. In many ways, I think it would have been better to have stuck with the 4.7 for logistics and just improved on it, but there we are. 4.5-inch was a significantly more powerful weapon than the 4.7 45, and with roughly the same weight. If you look at the gun mounting on the tribals, it comes to about 23 tons. The twin 4.5-inch mounting on the Ark Royal came to 29 tons. So on a ship of 1850 tons, it's a fair degree of extra weight if you're putting it on. But I mean, it would have saved the tribals from a good deal of aggravation, bearing in mind that of the 16 Royal Navy ships, 12 were sunk. Although it has to be said they weren't all sunk by aircraft, several of them were sunk by submarines or shore gunfire. So anyway, there's some additional thoughts. Hope you found the other material interesting, and I look forward to doing another version another time. Happy sailing.